If you go back to the focus groups that we were running at the start of this year, it was absolutely clear that if Boris were to fall under the proverbial bus, that most of the public and Conservative voters wanted Rishi Sunak to take over. They thought he'd performed well during furlough. People would say things in focus groups like he's more prime ministerial than the Prime Minister. Whereas very few people at that time were actually aware of Liz Truss. We forget sometimes that Westminster politicians we know very well don't always cut through with the public. That changed very dramatically for two reasons. Firstly, Liz's stature and profile really rose once Russia invaded Ukraine, and she was seen by the public and Tory voters to have had a strong response there. And then you've got the really dramatic turning point in April when news about some of Rishi's family's tax affairs came out, but also the fact that he was seen perhaps not quite to have got the moment on cost of living as well. And those two things sort of played into one another, this sense of, gosh, can this guy really get it? And I think that actually was the turning point in this race. And what it meant was that when Boris resigned, the two candidates, based on what we heard in focus groups, had quite different challenges. Rishi actually at that point then had to start changing some of the negative impressions that had formed of him. Whereas Liz Truss actually, she had to build more of a positive first impression with people. And what we've seen in those groups as the race has gone on is that actually Liz Truss has done that job better at building that positive first impression than Rishi Sunak has managed in terms of turning around those negative impressions that people had. And, you know, it may be fair, it might not be fair, but what's really interesting is that some of those, I guess what you might call image gaffes of Rishi have really cut through with the public. Things like, you know, the shoes, the contactless. And people say it's not because they're anti-aspiration. They don't mind people having money. They just say, does he really get it? Whereas Liz, yeah, and you really saw it in those debates, portraying herself as that plain-speaking Yorkshire woman, that's actually gone down really well.
That's a really interesting point, because we have a clip from one of your focus groups conducted in Stoke that discusses that very issue of how they performed in those debates. Let's have a listen.
I actually think she's a team player. Like I say, she has stood by Boris, hasn't she? And she wasn't really... He did interrupt. The bits that I saw, I did think he was quite rude, to be honest. He didn't really give her much of a chance.
She seemed to listen more yesterday. She did less interrupting, less talking over. And I think in that respect came across better for me.
Rishi talked over Liz a lot. I don't know, maybe I was reading too much into the psychology behind that, but I just thought he didn't come across very well, whereas Liz came across better.
That to me is so interesting, because so much of the commentary around these debates has been how slick Rishi Sunak is and how he's better at presentation, but Liz is better at policy, and policy is winning out over presentation. But to some extent, your focus group suggests that actually it's Liz who's winning on presentation.
Absolutely. Campaigns are about a moment. And what's really interesting is in this moment, people aren't looking for the slickest contender. In fact, when we polled the attributes that people were looking for in a potential leader, slick got just 1%. Far higher was straight talking, honest and competent. And I think Liz has presented herself as the candidate with those attributes and those values. And again, really interesting when we did that Stoke focus group, you know, lots of commenters said, oh, you know, Rishi did really well. He was dynamic. He was energetic. But people really didn't like the fact that he interrupted her so much. And they actually went on to say a bit later, it wasn't because, you know, it's not just about being rude. It's about the fact that actually if you do that, will you then listen? And when you're in a cost of living crisis, of course, as we are at the moment, what people really want is someone that they think will listen and then respond appropriately.